Hello, I am D-Man, and this is part 2 of a two-part series, so if you haven't seen part 1, you should probably watch it. If you have, welcome back. Last time we left off, Anne-Marie got voted off from the Mutant Maggots, and now we're on episode 7. And yeah, speaking of episode 7, let's just get right into it. This episode will start actually inside Mike's mind, where he is chained to a chiseled Mal rock. When he asks if there's anybody out there, Mal shows up in the weird flesh mirror looking thing, where they both briefly talk about whatever. And other than that, the start of this episode is almost the same. Everyone's still in the cafeteria looking for food. Lightning finds some meat in the freezer. Everyone goes in the freezer. They all get human trafficked by Chef to the mine. Chris explains the challenge, and then it begins. The only major difference here is that Dawn would all of a sudden notice this extremely negative energy from Mike slash Mal. I'll just say Mal from now on, but you know that when I say Mal, unless specified, he's pretending to be Mike. Now that the challenge starts, Lightning still goes shabam, causing all the rocks to fall on his team. This means the Mutant Maggots still get the flashlights in the elevator, and the elevator still crashes down. Now, somehow in the original episode, Joe just has like a jar of fireflies, but yeah, so now I guess I have Dawn with the jar instead. It's the most reasonable option here. She passes it to Brick while he's on the rope, but when he grabs the jar, well, he's not holding onto the rope anymore, so he falls down, gets the crazy rope burn, and releases the fireflies from the jar. Now, since Manitoba Smith never shows up here because, well, Mal's here, when the Mutant Maggots are met with the two different paths, they actually have no idea which path's the right path. However, if you look closely, one of the paths does look a lot nicer than the other. One of them has like this wooden framing, and it just generally looks to be in a better shape than the other path. And so Cameron would mention this, and say, hey, the left path looks better. Scott would still make his stupid right path the right path because it's right. No one cares, and they all go on the left path still anyway. They would go up to the carts, and Mal would recommend that they go on the carts to sort of speed up ahead, which they do. With Mal and Zoe in the front car, and Cameron Scott in the back car. Mal's just kind of hoping some chaos happens here. Which I guess he does get his wish, because the carts eventually separate, and they head in their separate directions. Scott and Cameron will end up in the water, and Mel and Zoe end up sort of above the water, above them, sort of on that like edge cliffside looking thing, and they are hurt. Mal, sort of quote unquote helping, he's like, he picks Zoe up from the ground and then sort of like accidentally like pushes her, accidentally in quotes, pushes her off of the cliff thing or whatever, pushes her into the water, basically. And so Zoe, Cameron, and Scott are in the water. Cameron can't swim, so Zoe sort of picks him up and, and like helps him stay afloat. And since Scott is left alone, when Ezekiel shows up, Ezekiel decides to kidnap Scott. Soon enough, Mal eventually they eventually reconnect in the actual episode, so Mal would eventually reconnect with Zoe and Cameron. All the badges would turn red, and Mal would, apologize to Zoe, saying, like, well, I just lost my footing, I didn't mean to knock you in the water. And, of course, Zoe and Cameron would eat it up. Meanwhile, Dawn is able to make the Fireflies sort of just act like orderly, creating a nice light source for her team, and unlike in the actual episode, they all stick together this time. However, Sam, he still hasn't had any games, and a whole extra episode has passed, so, yeah, when a mutant gopher shows up, Sam sees it as like some sort of video game boss fight and tries to fight it. Um, Dawn tells Sam not to fight it because it's one of Earth's creatures, but Sam just kind of delirious at the moment, and so he continues to try, pisses off the gophers, and then the gophers basically grab the rats from below, sending them underground and straight to Ezekiel's lair. Sort of, they get hanged by their like teeth or whatever alongside Scott. Um, Once the maggots make it to Ezekiel's lair as well, they also get confronted by the gophers. This is just like the actual episode. Um, Brick is sort of like scrambling at this point. He has no idea. He doesn't really know what to do. Accidentally kicks off one of his shoes um, towards the maggots, the mutant maggots. The smell of his shoes is, of course, dreadful. So it grosses out the gophers. And, he accidentally helps out the mutant maggots. However, knowing this, and Brick still having both his shoes now, he can kick his other shoe off. Manages to kick it off right next to him, Scott and the rest of the team, and so Brick then frees the rest of frees his team and Scott. Immediately after this, lightning just guns for the statue, but Ezekiel gets in the way, of course, and then when Chris announces, they can all drop their bombs, I mean bags. There's a little confessional where Mal is impressed that Chris would stoop to such evil, malevolent levels. When Mal grabs the statue, Zoe and Cameron say that they feel unwell, but Mal pretends not to hear them and so just kind of runs off to the carts right away. Kind of just leaving Scott on his own. Doesn't really want to go with Mal, so he's like, well, I guess I'll try and help not Mike and Zoe, Cameron and Zoe out. Of course, Scott struggles to do this, and so as the toxic rats manage to get the statue off of Ezekiel, Brick overhears Scott struggling to defend Zoe and Cameron, and so Brick gets out of the cart, breaks the statue over the gopher's head, saving Cameron, Zoe, and Scott, but, he also does cost his team the challenge, just like in the actual episode. Since Mal got out with the statue first, the mutant maggots would win the challenge, which, yes, it would annoy Scott, but I think he'd be somewhat relieved because, yeah, I don't think the vote looks great for him. Like, let's just say these three are probably voting him out, so he's a little relieved, actually. Cameron, yes, after the challenge, Cameron and Mal have a little bit of a brief conversation where Cameron's sort of a bit more like, hey, you really need to tell Zoe about your MPD at this point. Mal, hearing this for the first time, realizes, okay, this guy knows about the multiple personality disorder. Maybe I could use this to my advantage at some point. We'll get to what Mal's thinking later, but for the vote for the toxic rats, well, in the original, Brick was voted off here for helping the enemy team, and well, I think Lightning would still vote for Brick. Dawn and Sam, though, would actually appreciate Brick's sacrifice, and so, unlike Joe, I don't think they would vote for him. I think Sam, between Dawn and Lightning, would vote for Lightning. I just think Lightning's got a pretty big ego. And is also, Sam's like a bit of a nerd. Lightning's a jock. Got that thing going on, so I think Sam would vote for Lightning. I think Dawn would vote for Sam, because, Sam has just been delusional these last two episodes. He's practically he's not in the right state of mind, to put it simply, and Brick sort of reluctantly does the same, Lightning is a close call, but, Lightning, his head's in the game, he's useful, and, Sam, Brick he likes Sam, but it's just like, you know, they sort of want to vote. They sort of want to get Sam off so Sam can, recover basically. And so with 2 votes, Sam I think is voted off. Dakota, who is now bald, would meet Sam at the docks, where she would still give Sam her number. This would temporarily knock Sam out of his delusional state. Whoa, actually, I got the girl? Hell yeah. Chris then tells Dakota that, yeah, she's actually joining Sam and that they're now both out of the show. But, neither seem to mind that much as they get flung away together. The reason for this is because Anne-Marie did not quit the show here. This episode is no longer a double elimination, and because this episode is no longer a double elimination, Chris has no reason to bring Dakota back. And so with that, the episode ends right there with these 7. Alright, now we're on to episode 8. This episode starts the same, with all the contestants waking up on the wood raft in the middle of the lake, and Chris announcing that someone has found the Chris head immunity idol, invincibility statue, whatever. Now, at this point in the show, Dawn would still have what she thinks is the idol. But the way Chris words the announcement wouldn't actually bring up too much suspicion for Dawn. It's a little weird, but not too suspicious. When the challenge starts, Lightning rips off the sign and paddles with it, which gives the maggots the idea to do the same. Dawn, once again, since the rafts are right next to each other, Dawn once again notices the negative energy from Mal. This time, however, looking through his soul and into Mike's mind, Dawn is able to briefly talk to Mike inside his mind. Sort of like how Izzy did it in All Stars. This, of course, confuses the fuck out of everyone there, except for Cameron, who knows about the potential existence of Mal, so he sort of suspects that, like, yeah, okay, maybe, yeah, Mal is back, and, like, maybe this is the problem that's going on. Mal is a little bothered by this, of course, because, like, he wasn't expecting that, and, like, he doesn't want that to be revealed necessarily. Manages to... He's like, he needs a distraction, so he manages to get the sign-off for his own team, and they start to row as well. Because of this, Scott's never in the water. Which means Fang is never there to get to sort of hear or see Scott kicking his feet, so Fang never, tries to get Scott. When both teams get to face the Kraken creature, Cameron gets the same idea as in the cannon, letting the monster sort of launch them to the beach, which makes the mutant maggots win the first part of the challenge. This means that the losing team has those giant weights on them. Lightning does just fine. Brick would struggle a little, but he would mostly be able to handle it, and yeah, I don't think Dawn's gonna do very well, to be honest. Yeah. Dawn ain't moving. Lightning picks her up, but then he's not able to go very fast. And then that's 2 lots of weight, and that's a lot of weight. So, Dawn realizing this is like, you know what, Brick, Lightning, just leave me behind. I can't do this. But Brick never lets a man behind, and so he then picks her up and walks very slowly with her, sort of basically letting Lightning go ahead to try and win the challenge for this team all by himself. We'll see how that goes. When the mutant maggots arrive at the swamp, Mal and Cameron sort of scat ahead, and so Zoe and Scott briefly stay behind. Scott draws the arrow on the ground to try and get the other team to go in the right direction, because he's still trying to throw challenges. And then he shows Zoe his idol to try and gain trust and to make Zoe distrust Mike. Doesn't necessarily bring up Cameron because there's not really that as much of an interaction there. When Lightning arrives at the swamp, he originally says that he doesn't want to go into the stink, and so he sees the arrow, but he's like, I don't want to smell like shit. So he decides to take the long way and tries to go around the swamp. Meanwhile, when the maggots encounter the crocodile squid-like creature, Mal decides to intentionally but briefly reveal himself to jump onto the creature's eyes, basically like poking his eyes, sending it away, before knocking Zoe into the muddy water, just for the fun of it, I think. When Zoe gets back up, Mal pretends to turn back into Mike, saying he got a little carried away with his method acting, which makes Zoe a little suspicious, and, well, now Cameron now knows for a fact that Mal does exist. But, and what, this is the thing, Mal can use that to his advantage. Cameron doesn't know that Mal's here permanently. Cameron only thinks Mal is showing up occasionally. And so, when Mal does the Mike act, everyone believes him. And he also is now occasionally able to have his fun, because he can turn to Mal and be basically his true self. Scott also is now starting to suspect that Mal might be the one to break Joe's whistle and Brick's alarm clock. And if from what he just saw, he just saw Mike do this crazy thing, and Scott's like, yeah, I kind of doubt Zoe or Cameron would do this. So Scott sort of suspects that, doesn't really care that much, but he just sort of keeps that in mind. And of course he wants to figure out what's going on exactly, because, to be fair, Mike/Mal has been acting pretty suspicious the whole season. Scott is going to want to know what's going on there. They eventually figure out that they need to head north, but without Dakotazoid to clear the path of the Thornbush Forest, they can't go through it. There's no way to go through it. So they kind of have no choice but to go the long way around. They have to get back to the start and then around. And so, yeah, they reach the start of the lake where they see Brick and Dawn and the arrow. Cameron knows that the arrow wasn't there before, and so sort of thinks, okay, someone on my team must be trying to help the other team, or is trying to throw the challenges. Doesn't know who. Could be Mal, could be Scott, Cameron's probably not thinking Zoe, but Cameron's probably thinking it's either Scott or Mal being Mal. While this happens, Lightning takes a while, but because it's taken so long, Lightning has managed to go around the sort of swamp. He manages to find the key, unlocks himself, and then just with his bare hands, he just basically single-handedly wins the challenge for his team. Yeah, turns out, Lightning has still got it. And so yeah, the Mutant Maggots lose this challenge. After the challenge, Scott originally goes up to Cameron to try and get Cameron to spill secrets, but now instead goes to Mike to try and get Mike to spill his own secrets. But suddenly, Mal shows up, throws Scott onto the ground, before then pretending to turn back into Mike. Basically, basically sort of warning Scott, don't fuck with me, or I'm gonna mess your shit up. Cameron also talks to what he thinks is Mike, saying that, with his MPD, Mal showed up, and so, Mal's like, he pretends to be like, oh no, Mal showed up, and then in the confessional, Mal's like, what a fucking idiot. And yeah, now we get to the vote, and this vote is something else. I think Scott votes for Mal, right? Scott has Zoe's trust. Scott, showed Zoe the idol and everything, and Scott pretty much just he doesn't give a shit about Cameron really. It's just a bubble boy, and I mean Mike's seeming a little unstable, and so yeah, I think Scott would vote for Mal. Cameron likes Zoe, and of course also likes Mike. More so than normal here because like they've been friends for even longer, and so Cameron would vote for Scott. Uh, Now Zoe is actually really hard. Let's do Scott's vote first. Scott would vote for not Scott's vote. Jesus Christ. Mal's vote. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. Sorry. Mal, between these three, would vote for Cameron. Since other than Dawn, yeah, Cameron has basically figured out the most, and so Mal just really wants Cameron gone for that reason, and also just in All Stars, like for some reason Mal just fucking really wanted Cameron gone, and so I think Mal would vote for Cameron. So everyone's got one vote except for Zoe. Zoe is the deciding vote. Zoe and Mike they're a couple, or at this point already. It hasn't been very long, but Zoe's obviously not going to vote out Mal. And between Scott and Cameron, well, Zoe likes the both of them, but Scott, shown the idol, he's proven his trust, and so I think Zoe actually would vote for Cameron here, of all people. Meaning that Cameron gets 2 votes and is, voted off for the show. And with that, we make it to the merge. Yeah, our contestants, we got 3 mutant maggots, 3 toxic rats, a nice balance this time, which is good. Let's do that, and let's do that. Alright, let's move on to episode 9. Alright, so we've now reached the merge. This episode would start in Mike's mind with him, sort of finding Chester and all that stuff from All Stars. But now it's here. Afterwards, Chris announces the teams have officially merged. Dawn and Zoe being the only girls left here, they sort of talk about, maybe working together. But then once Dawn brings up Mike and his negative energy, Zoe is sort of a bit skeptical of this. Like, Mike's been nice to her all season. And then Dawn sort of implies, Mike's got MPD, but Zoe doesn't quite understand, and so Zoe just gets even more confused at Dawn. When we get to the actual challenge, of course Scott won't be able to blackmail Mal because none of that's really happened. But Mal will still not want to help Zoe, so Zoe will get annoyed at Mal for not helping her with the squid thing. Also because of this, originally Mike finds that golden key, and because Scott's blackmailed him, Mike's forced to give the golden key up, and then Scott gives Mike his key. That doesn't happen, so Mal ends up with the golden key, and Scott ends up with the key that basically Mike ends up with originally. Lightning and Zoe, I don't see why they'd get any different keys. They would still get the same keys for the go-karts. And then as for Brick and Dawn, I've got no idea since they weren't originally there. Cameron's was originally under the table, where he sort of like got hurt and like got bitten by that like cockroach thing, and Joe's was originally in like a trash bin. So I feel like it makes more sense, and I feel like Brick would be more likely to look under the table, and I think Dawn seems to just like collect a lot of weird things, has sort of like a trash bag on her, so I think she's more willing to look through a trash bin to find a key. Um, so that means Brick would end up with Cameron's key, and Dawn would end up with Joe's key. Now, when it comes to getting the go-karts, Chef's army of laser squirrels um, will still do the thing. I still think Lightning will get like trapped in the corner, and so he gets sent to the prison or whatever. I think Mal would do just fine. I think, in All Stars, when he's off on Boney Island, he manages to like scare the shit out of all the animals, and so I think he'll do something like that where he'll scare the like laser squirrels, which for the record Dawn will not appreciate. I also think Mal would help Zoe here. Zoe wanted help from Mike originally. Mike's unable to because Scott's blackmail, but now, of course, I think Mal would reluctantly help Zoe just to not look as suspicious. Since, he's already ignored her once. If he ignores her again, it could look bad on him. I reckon Dawn will be able to find some way to calm down some of the laser squirrels, so I think she'll be able to get in a cart. So as for Scott, he originally sort of used Mike as like a shield, but he was also never in like that precarious of a situation. Like, he wasn't really getting targeted originally, so I still think he'd be able to get into his cart. And then as for Brick, I can't imagine him like doing too. I don't know. I just don't think he'd do too well. I think for the sake of like having sort of simplifying things a bit, I think he would get captured with Lightning, and so those two will be in sort of the jail that's guarded by Fang. Now, when it comes to those go-karts, I think Zoe would leave first. I think, and then Scott would be second, and Scott would now have a normal go-kart, right? He doesn't have the golden one. He just has his regular one, which is bad news for Mal because Mal, having the golden cart, there's no front wheel, so it don't do shit. However, because Dawn now has Joe's go-kart, which, if you remember, was like, it just kept like going and stopping and going and stopping, so these two would be like not really getting anywhere. So Mal would try and work with Dawn. However, Dawn basically says like, I will never work with someone with like such a negative aura, and she like starts questioning where like the real Mike went, which makes Mal furious. So he reveals himself to Dawn, like grabs her arm, and is like, "You will help me." And she basically has no choice but to accept in fear of, being hurt. So Mal basically does the thing that like Scott originally did to Mike. So Mal like ties his cart to Dawn, and Dawn will hopefully that will work. But Dawn's go-kart sucks, so yeah, Scott and Zoe are really the only ones competing for the moment. Meanwhile, we still have like Lightning and Brick in their makeshift jail. They are still able to break out, right? Lightning can bend the bars like straws, but instead of Joe betraying Lightning here, Brick actually ends up sacrificing himself to help Lightning, which Lightning will appreciate. I think Lightning will appreciate that, which means Lightning is able to quickly get in his car, and he quickly sort of gets past Mal and Dawn, which just annoys Mal even more. Scott and Zoe, I think, would manage to tag the first two spots, mostly in a bit of friendly competition, since, Scott and Zoe are still, they're still kind of friends, so, yeah. Then we have the whole thing with, Chef being annoyed over this whole challenge, so comes up, has, the fake Chris tell the contestants, hey, you gotta tag a fourth spot now, and then Lightning tags his first spot, and then, of course, then Mal and Dawn do, but doesn't super matter. When it comes to the third location, again, I think Zoe and Scott are going to be pretty much neck and neck. However, Scott, sort of playing dirty, as he sort of does, in the original, he throws his can at Zoe, which sort of leaves her like hanging on the edge, and then he tags the location before going to the fourth location. Zoe will be hanging on. There'll be no one to save her, so Zoe will just fall basically. So that sucks for her. That will obviously make Zoe upset at Scott. Now, of course, I could talk about the fourth location, but it doesn't matter since it's not actually part of the challenge, right? Like, Chris nullifies it. So, I mean, I'd imagine, like, Lightning would still be face, and then, like, Duncan blows it up still, but regardless, I mean, Scott basically still wins the challenge here. And in this episode, Scott could choose anyone to get rid of his choosing. And for me, there's sort of two options. And I think it's going to be Lightning or Mal. Right, I mean, Scott's gotten along with Dawn, Scott's gotten along with Zoe. Brick could also be a potential, but Brick's done, like, pretty horrendous in the challenges, so I think Scott wouldn't see Brick as, like, as much of a threat as, like, Lightning, for an example. Lightning is obviously makes sense because, like, Lightning's really good at the, like, athleticism and stuff, and Mal, well, obviously he doesn't know that, but, like, in his mind, he needs to break up the Zoe Mike thing. And so, and, like, also, Mal sort of threatening him last episode. I think it makes sense. I think Scott would get rid of Mal, which really sucks because this whole video is called What If Mal is in Revenge of the Island, and, it doesn't even fucking make it that far. Scott just gets rid of his ass. Yeah, when Mal's eliminated, he's just in a fit of rage. He's just like, you know what? Fuck it. Mike's gone forever, and I'm gonna get my revenge. And then Mal leaves. Zoe is distraught by this sort of turn of events, to which Dawn tries her best to comfort Zoe. That's essentially the end of episode 9. Bit of a downer episode here, but let's move on to episode 10. This episode pretty much starts the same with, like, Scott and Fang having a little rivalry thing before we get a conversation with Dawn and Zoe. Zoe doesn't really understand what's been happening with Mike since, remember, Mike actually never told Zoe about the multiple personality disorder, and so Dawn pretty much says Mike has multiple personality disorder and that for some reasons there seems to be some other personality in control right now. Dawn clarifies that, just because Mike's gone now doesn't mean he's gone forever. They can still get Mike back. Well, not right now because they're in a competition and Mal's not here, but, afterwards. Zoe, starting to trust Dawn more and Scott less, since, I mean, think about last episode, Scott messed with her and then voted off what they thought was Mike. Is like, you know what? I'm going to tell Dawn about Scott's immunity statue. Because Scott did mention it, and so Zoe basically said, hey, Scott's got the idol, by the way. Dawn would be confused by this because she would think that she actually has the idol, and so she would show her fake idol to Zoe. And even though Dawn can't tell, Zoe, because she's seen the real statue, right, the real immunity idol, would be able to tell the slight discrepancies between the two, and so Zoe would sort of be like, I'm sorry, but I think it's a fake. Dawn would try and deny it, but sort of deep down is like, she's just kind of in denial, like, she worries that, like, what if Zoe's right? Anyways, we have sort of the challenge where they will have to make a flying machine. Lightning still has to build a helicopter, Zoe still has to build a plane, and Scott still has to build a fucking bird. As for Brick and Dawn, though, I mean, again, it's sort of the bag they pick out of is kind of gross. I'm just imagining Dawn would be a little less grossed out by it, and so just she would pick first, basically, which would end up giving her the hot air balloon because Joe originally picked first, and then Brick would basically take Cameron's spot, and so yeah, Brick's got to make a fucking rocket ship which kind of screws him because yeah, no one can make a rocket ship other than Cameron here, so or B, I suppose. Um, Now, as for whether Dawn can make a hot air balloon or not is a bit of a toss-up, but like, if Lightning can make a fucking helicopter, and like all the parts are there, right? Joe has all the parts. You know, there is some sort of balloon somewhere and a heat source and everything. So I'm sure they're like planted by like production. So I'm sure Dawn will be able to find some. I'm sure Dawn will be able to make something. It's just probably not as good as the one Karen builds for Joe. Now originally Karen wins the smoke machine, but now someone else has to be the first to show Chris their flying machine, and I think it would be Zoe. And my sort of reasoning is it was between her and Lightning, because Lightning's machine was like it's really simple. It's like a motorbike and a big fan and like some rope attaching it together, which I know Lightning's not that smart, but like he was able to make that still, and like it worked. I know cartoon logic, but it did work, so what am I to argue? Um, Also, it's worth noting that Lightning like tried to hide some of Joe's stuff originally. Now it's going to be Dawn's stuff, so that's going to slow Dawn down a little, since, you know, there's no one to really help. Scott obviously has to make a fucking bird, that's... he's not having a good time. And with Zoe, the reason basically why I think Zoe would win is that in the episode she manages to build her plane before Lightning builds his helicopter, and so I think that would give Zoe the smoke machine. Not that the smoke machine's super important. The second part of this challenge, where Heather still throws Chris and Chef out of the plane, that all still happens. This second part mostly plays out the same. Fang still finds Scott, chases after Scott, which then means Fang gets attached to Dawn's balloon, which Dawn doesn't realize at first. Zoe would realize that like Brick has no like way to fly. He's basically just stuck on the ground. Would be nice enough to let Brick have a seat on a plane. Partly also as a thanks for Brick saving her life in episode 7, the Down the Mine. So most of this challenge again would play it similarly. Zoe and Brick would end up on those like flying mountain goat thing. They would still burn Scott to a crisp. And he would land in the water. This time without Fang being there, like Fang would just be like stuck to Dawn the whole time. Dawn would, I think, just do fine on the balloon, but like I just don't think she would get anywhere. At least not as fast as Lightning did, because Lightning originally just crashed into the blimp, and he started fighting with Heather for the money. And the only reason Lightning didn't win the challenge was because of Cameron's rocket basically crashing into the blimp. But now without that, the blimp just kind of like slowly falls into the water, meaning that like, yeah, Lightning was technically the person that stopped Heather, which means Lightning is immune for this challenge. Now when it comes down to this vote, I think Zoe and Dawn would vote for Scott. It's sort of, I mean, Zoe wants to try and get rid of Scott's idol, and, you know, Dawn's a little less certain of it, but, like, I think Dawn would still want to vote Scott regardless out of these four. I think if Lightning hadn't won, I think she would have voted for Lightning otherwise, because, you know, Dawn and Scott have gotten, like, along okay in this season. I think, yeah. And then, like, I think Brick, I mean, again, Scott's the only choice, I think, out of these three. So Scott is definitely getting all the votes. It is worth mentioning, we also mentioned Lightning's vote. I think Lightning would also vote Scott here. I thought about, like, Lightning voting for Brick, but Brick was also nice to him last episode, so I think Lightning would want to try and, like... I think Lightning would, like, want to try and, like, you know, return the favor a little bit. And, you know, with Dawn, he's just kind of weirded out by her a little bit, and then, like, doesn't really see her as much of a threat as Scott. So they all vote for Scott. But, if you remember, Scott still has his idol. And so, really all that matters is, Who does Scott vote for between Zoe, Dawn, and Brick? There's a few options. Zoe did target him this episode, right? That's a big thing, right? I guess Brick would have also been there. I guess maybe he also would have targeted Scott. I don't think he's voting Dawn. Dawn hasn't really done much to him. I mean, he knows they all voted for him, but like everyone did. But I also think it's worth mentioning that like because Zoe and Dawn know that they're voting for Scott with the idol, they would be like trying to work with him a bit. So like Zoe would go up to Scott at some point before the vote and be like, "Hey, let's vote off blah blah blah," and and then betray him basically. Basically, Zoe just wants it so it's like she wants to just make sure that she doesn't go home. So Zoe would like pretend to forgive Scott and everything, like, "Oh, everything's okay." And I think Dawn would also try and Dawn would try and see if like Scott actually has an idol or not. I can see a scene where like um Dawn, she says like, "Hey, I've had this idol," and then like Scott's like really awkward. But he's like, "Oh wow, that's really cool." Um, yeah, I mean, it's between Brick and Zoe, and honestly, I think Scott would have tried to convince the two of them to vote out Brick, and so I think Brick is unfortunately voted out with one vote against his name, which really sucks, but that is what it is. Right, episode 11. Honestly, the first part of this is about the same, just like replace Cameron with Dawn. Well, I guess until you get to the cooking challenge, because like Dawn probably wouldn't make the same thing as Cameron, but at the same time, I don't really know what she would try and make. But all I know is it wouldn't have like animals in it or anything. So like, just for the sake of having some idea of what to do from here, I'll just have Dawn also make the quiche. There's no animals in that. So I think that could work okay. It definitely wouldn't be as good as Cameron's quiche, but it will be a quiche nonetheless. Regardless, I still think it'd be the best dish, and so I think Scott would still try and copy it. And so when they get to the part where they have to eat their challenge, Scott would trick Dawn, swap his and her meal, and then Scott would win the first part of the challenge. Then as for the second part of the challenge, of course, this time no one would be able to take the shock collars off. Scott doesn't have one because he won the first part of the challenge, but Lightning, Zoe, and Dawn would be stuck with the collars on. Zoe here would be also still very worried about the whole Mike Mao situation, like, more so than in canon. And so, same thing still happens when, like, Chef finds her first, shoots her off the cliff, and Zoe would still go crazy and becoming Commando Zoe. And then after falling into one of Commando Zoe's traps, I think then Chef would go after Lightning and Dawn. The two of them haven't really done much together this season, but they decide, sticking together is better than nothing. However, with them being able to obviously get off their collars, I think Chef would find them pretty easily. I think Lightning would be able to get away just because of his like sheer athleticism. And also, Dawn's an easier target, so I think Chef would like target Dawn, and I think Chef would succeed in basically like shooting Dawn with the meatballs, basically trapping her. She can't win. Scott, he basically like walks up to the finish flag. He nearly makes it, but sort of once again, Fang shows up, and same sort of thing that happens with like Commander Zoe and Chef, and Scott rolls around the boulder, and he just gets fucking brutalized. And so as Chef and Zoe sort of keep fighting each other, Lightning manages to get past them both to the finish flag, and without Cameron to steal the victory from him this time, Lightning manages to win himself immunity. So, when it comes to the voting, originally Scott got 2 votes, Zoe got 1, and Lightning got 1. I'd imagine that Scott still votes for Zoe, I'd imagine Zoe still votes for Scott. Right? That seems to be what happened originally. I think originally Cameron voted for Lightning. It makes sense because Lightning's really pissed at him all of a sudden. But that vote doesn't really matter because Cameron's not here and Lightning's immune anyways. And which also means that the only vote left, Scott's second vote, must have come from Lightning, so Lightning and Zoe still vote for Scott. Scott still votes for Zoe. And Dawn... Does Dawn also vote for Scott, or does Dawn vote for Zoe? Yeah, it's pretty obvious. Dawn is going to vote for Scott. Scott's eliminated. Yeah, he gets fucked up. Yeah, there's honestly really not much to say about episode 12. It's sort of a similar situation where, like, just imagine, instead of Cameron, it's Dawn. Except, Lightning wouldn't be angry at anyone anymore. Still be ultra competitive. He'd still be, it'd still be Dawn and Commando Zoe versus Lightning here. Dawn would be obviously trying to help Zoe get out of the, like, Commando phase. And I think, in general, I think Dawn and Zoe would get along better than Zoe and Cameron originally did. Partly because Dawn would be better at the challenge, but also just Dawn does have sort of a way of talking to people. So I think there would be a big difference at the end of the episode. Since Dawn's better at the challenges, it's more understanding of Zoe's situation, right? Dawn knows why Zoe's upset. I think they would work together better, and so I think Dawn would trust Zoe enough to throw the flower at Zoe. And I also think, in general, Dawn would be able to handle Larry better. So when all said is done, I actually think Zoe would win the challenge, and yeah, Zoe's not bringing Lightning to the end. It's our final two is Dawn and Zoe, which is certainly an ending. And we'll briefly talk about how this ending would go. The finale would start with sort of Mike and all his personality sort of at the bottom of Mouse Tower, so you'd still have all of that. Dawn and Zoe would obviously try and have like a bit of a friendship finale, but Zoe would be pretty preoccupied with the whole Mao thing, like Mao would be just there. And since Mao is also no longer pretending to be Mike, and Scott's, still out of commission, I think Mao would just... Mao would be the big villain this episode. He would be like trying to sabotage Zoe and Dawn. He'd just be trying to steal the money for himself. Completely breaking all the rules and everything. Which, I'll be honest, could make for a pretty, like, interesting finale. Of course, I imagine, we still get this sort of thing with the reset button, and so Mike is... or, he's cured or whatever, which sucks ass, but that's what happens. Between the two endings, I imagine the alternate endings would stem from, like, when the reset button gets pressed. I reckon in Dawn's ending, Zoe would be pinned down by Mao. Dawn would win, and then Mike would show up. And Dawn's ending, it would sort of be, the reset button would be pressed a bit earlier. Mike shows up. Zoe never gets pinned down. Dawn gets pinned down by something else. Zoe wins. Regardless, after whoever wins, Mike would then confess, I've got multiple personality disorder, to which Zoe already knows about, because of Dawn, but, forgives him, and, she says she's happy to continue dating him after the show and everything, so they both kiss, and hooray, good ending for them. I think in Dawn's ending, she would end up spending the money on, like, protecting nature and stuff, which would honestly be a very appropriate ending, considering the island they're on is, like, a fucking environmental disaster. And in Zoe's ending, I imagine she would, like, share some of the money with everyone, sort of like how Cameron did. And that's pretty much it. That is What If Mao was in Revenge of the Island. I must admit, I was a little disappointed to see Mao go so early. Mao really was only a thing for like 3 episodes. But surprisingly, even though Mao didn't do a ton himself, just Mike's not really having any of his personalities and everything really did shake up the elimination order for a bit there. Yeah, this is a very different order, even though a lot of the events are very similar. And yeah, if you liked that video, like and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time.